only mode.
Welcome to the Practice Discipleship Initiative webinar series. My name is Dawn Troutman, and I am your host throughout this series. You can find out more about me at LutheranLifeCoach.com, and you may also have met me at the Extravaganza, our annual event for the ELCA Youth Ministry Network. This initiative is a dynamic partnership between the ELCA Youth Ministry Network, the ELCA and its youth gathering, and ELCA seminaries and colleges. Practice Discipleship offers leadership development for the sake of faith formation. The theme for this year is Story. There will be a series of 7 webinars that focus on Lutheran theology, ministry theory, and practical skills relating to our theme. And you see here today we're at Story of Self and Others, the 5th in the series. And today's webinar is presented by Mindy Maycant. She's an assistant professor at Lenore Rhine University, and you can see her picture there. Before I turn it over to Mindy, I want to draw your attention to the box at the right side of your screen. That is where you can type in questions as we go, and I do encourage you to type in questions as we're going along so that it feels somewhat like a conversation and you are very much a part of the conversation. So type in questions. I will keep an eye on that, and at a little break in the conversation, I will pass those questions on to Mindy or anything else. It doesn't have to be a question if it's a comment or if it's something out of your experience that will contribute to the conversation. We really do value that, and we want you to contribute. So with that said, I will turn it over. Welcome, Mindy.
Thank you very much, Dawn. Thank you. All right, I'm going to start with talking about the importance of stories. First of all, I want everybody that, if you can listen and think for a minute about your story. We're all a story. None of us can be summarized by facts about who we are, but we're all sort of actually a complicated mess of both our stories and the stories of all the people that we've ever interacted with. In other words, to know me, to know any one of us, necessarily means to know your story, part of it anyway. So to give you kind of an example, hopefully this will make a little bit more sense. Since you can't see me, if I were to describe myself to you, Dawn started with a picture, but if I were to describe myself to you, I said I'm middle-aged, female, average height, a little smaller than average build, dark hair. Does that make you know me? Right? I mean, the answer is obviously no. You might be able to recognize me if you were picking me up from the airport, but you wouldn't know me. Now, if instead of just describing facts, I tell you some stories, stories, of course, reveal more of my character, my personality. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to tell you 2 short stories and see what you think. The first, both of these are parenting stories because they're just funnier. So when my son, I can't help that. So when my son was, I have 2 children. When my youngest child was a toddler, he picked his nose, something many toddlers do, right? And parents, of course, always hate this. But rather than engaging in like a power struggle argument with my 2-year-old over the virtues of not notes picking, I told him that he was welcome to pick his nose. I said, sweetheart, by all means, please pick your nose. However, I want you to know, because I love you and I'm your mommy and I really, really love you, that there are mites that live in the bridge of your nose. And so when you pick your nose, it's always possible that they might bite your fingertip off. It's your choice. Your choice, right? But you decide. You're going to pick your nose. And, of course, he quit picking his nose. He did it for a little while where he'd really, really quickly, like, do little quick jabs. But he worried about the mites, and he quit picking his nose, and I never had to argue with him about it. All right, so that's one story. Mostly this is going to explain why my children will need therapy when they're grown. But so another story, my daughter, so my older child, when she was 11, 12 years old, she was a very small child and very flat-chested. And she asked me, as many young girls her age at that time would have been worried about, when was she going to develop? And totally without thinking, I responded, again, totally without thinking about the fact that I was talking to a 12-year-old adolescent. I don't know, sweetheart. I didn't develop until I got pregnant. Not the kind of answer that a 12-year-old girl needs, right?
Right.
So now I've told you those just 2 tiny, tiny little stories. Do you feel like you would know me a little bit better? I mean, I think the answer for anybody would be yes. Obviously, you don't really know me still. But the more stories we have about another person, and even more importantly, the more stories we share with that person, the more we actually know that person. Does that make sense?
Yes, the stories fill in gaps and they make you be uniquely you.
There, exactly. That's what makes me who I am. I mean, there is no me that's separate from all of the accumulated stories that build there. There's this great short story by Sandra Cisneros who it's called 11, and she talks about how when you're 11, you're not only 11. When you're
Mhm.
11, you're 11 and you're 10 and you're 9 and you're 8 and you're 7 and you're 6 and you're 5 and you're 4 and you're 3 and you're 2 and you're 1, because you're always that getting older is like rings on an onion. You're always all of those people at the same time. And so the same thing is true of your stories. You're never just any one story. Each one of us is always that whole conglomeration of all the stories that have shaped who we are. And this is true with good stories, with bad stories, with happy stories, with sad stories. We can't just isolate one part of the story. And so why understanding this matters is because the way that we are hospitable to others has to include welcoming not only the story that we like, but the whole story of the
I,
other person.
I love that. And Julia, I think, has used the written version of your session that you're doing right now. And she wrote, when leading this opening activity of having others describe her simply by looking at her, it was interesting how easily others projected their stories and hopes onto her. For example, many people want lots of babies, and they must have assumed that about Julia by looking at her. Thank you, Julia.
That's fascinating. Yes, that's very interesting how people would then assume their own story is normative.
Yes.
And that's exactly what we do. I mean, because how else would we assume the world? I mean, the only lens I have to see the world is through my own story.
And we assume we are normal, right? Everybody does.
Absolutely. Oh, of course, absolutely. Of course, I'm the one that's normal. Anybody that's different must be a little bit off. I mean, and even when we know that that's not true, it is the way we experience the world, right?
Hmm.
And I think that there's truth to that.
Yeah.
Eh,
Thank
So
you,
when
Julia.
yes, thank you very much. And so right, so looking at this slide that is up now, this is called the icon of the hospitality of Abraham. And so it's an image of the three visitors who came to visit Abraham and Sarah and to announce that Sarah would bear a child a year later. If you remember in the actual Genesis account, it's really a story of hospitality. Right? There's a story where the visitors come, they're strangers in a strange place, and Sarah and Abraham provide a place to rest and a meal. And we know because we know the story, but Sarah and Abraham wouldn't have known this at the time, that when they leave, they discover that these weren't just everyday visitors, that this was a divine visitation. So this same icon also gets called the icon of the Holy Trinity because it represents the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as well as representing the visitors to Abraham. But part of what's important about this icon and about what the story that's behind it is that when Abraham and Sarah provided hospitality to these strangers, they also were providing it to God, right? I mean, this is Hebrews 13. We have this, right, not being afraid to provide hospitality to others because we may entertain angels unaware. And part of what happens in this story is not only that the hospitality provided is a matter of food, that's part of it, but the hospitality provided is largely about providing a space that's not only safe, but that it is safe, but that it is comfortable and home-like. And so if you can imagine what actually happened, and when we read the scripture, it's so short. This little scene just passes by with almost unnoticed. But what happens has to be hours of sitting around and talking. And I mean, they didn't just eat and leave. I mean, they had to kill an animal and prepare a meal and food that had to be prepared. So there's time that's passing, and what's happening during that time is going to be this conversation that's being shared. And it's in that conversation, that welcoming of the other, that we learn their story. So if you can imagine in this icon that that's part of what's happening, is that Abraham and Sarah are inviting these people these visitors, these strangers in, and in this act of hospitality, there's a large part of that is a listening to their stories. And part of this, if you think of, and it's in Romans 15, where Paul says that we're to, most translations say welcome one another, but another translation of that would be to receive one another, right? We receive those um, that come to us. And so if we think about that in terms of in our congregational life, then part of what the hospitality of the church is a reception of the other. But that reception has to mean not just that we provide food or we provide clothing or we provide whatever physical needs, though those are important. It has to also mean that there's a reception of the person's story, not just their physical selves, but the story that makes that self up, that that makes that person who that person is.
And isn't part of our modern society about protecting ourselves from each other's story?
Unfortunately, so much of it is, right? So much of it is in terms of personally, and then in terms of thinking about liability. I mean, think about FERPA and HIPAA and all the laws that
Mm,
prevent us from talking to one another. Um,
yes.
particularly, and some of that, of course, is right. That the protection of vulnerable parties is right, but at the same time, when we close one another off for this, we're worried about privacy or we're worried about confidentiality, um, and then we stop talking and listening to one another.
Right. And that's where the humanity is.
Exactly, exactly. And so part of what recognizing that willingness to open yourself up and not only to receive another person's story, but to share your story is recognizing that if I share my story with you, I'm actually giving you a part of who I am. It's not really an exchange of information. When we sit down and have a heart-to-heart conversation, this isn't a question of me giving you facts. It's
Mhm.
not an exchange of information. It's not like we're changing business cards, right? That I'm gonna have
Right.
a collection of business cards and I'm just adding you to that. To actually exchange stories with one another binds us together with one another. That actually makes our lives intersect in ways that are complicated and interesting, but
Mhm.
importantly formative. They help shape us in terms of our spiritual life, they help shape our faith. You think about the complex variety of people that all of our lives intersect with, and how all of their stories have become a part of what not only what I've heard and listened to, but if I've actually received it, I can't be the same person after knowing that story that I was before. I can never unknow it.
Right. I'm this is making me think of Humans of New York. Do you know that Instagram
I
account?
do, I do. I love some of those pictures and the stories that he tells.
Well, the stories are amazing, and I'll just say I happen to be in New York City. The other level of that, when you're in New York and you see that, is the pictures are always in places that all of us just were. So
Oh,
when I see a picture posted, I know that it's at a certain corner of the Times Square subway stop, and I very well could have walked past that guy
that
today.
same person. That's really interesting.
So it's another level of powerful of just sending this message. Yes, we're 11 million people circulating around, but it makes you feel like the people around you have stories.
And of course, we all do,
Yes,
but
it's
we very
brilliant.
rarely take the time to get to know them. And one of the things that's happened in the church over time is that churches have become places, to a large extent, of people with very, very, very similar stories. And part of what I believe we're called to do is to welcome and receive those with stories whose actually are quite different from ours. Actually,
Yes.
the Humans of New York's a great example of that,
Mhm.
recognizing that the stories that can be vastly different. And part of what I think we as a people, as Christians, are called to do is develop, and it takes skill. I mean, it's not something we're necessarily just born with, or maybe we are and we unlearn it. But
Mhm.
either way, we need to develop the skills necessary to become the people who are actively seeking, like that gentleman does, taking those pictures. He's actively
Yes.
seeking to not to know, again, not to know like I want to have a collection of cards, not to know, for the exchange of information, but to really know about someone as a person. Um, and not simply regardless of any differences in religion or social status or race or gender or whatever else,
Hmm.
but actually taking those things into account as important factors. Like those shape how I see the world. I can't not see the world as a middle aged white woman
Right. And you want someone's story because they see the world differently, and that's the
differently.
only way to get a window.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So those different stories are what provide all of us with a different lens that we can see the world. I can never see it really through somebody else's eyes, but I can see it a little bit better through their eyes if I hear and listen to and genuinely receive their story. And that opens up all sorts of possibilities in my mind. If I start to imagine that the way I see the world just might not be the only way to see it, that there just might be other legitimate ways to understand whatever, whether it's cooking or cleaning or how one does this, that, or the other, there might
Right.
be application of that to our faith life. There may, in fact, be ways that someone else worships, that someone else understands what being faithful looks like through their set of lenses that opens up the world to me and actually expands my understanding of who God is and how God is acting in the world.
I love it.
So let me
I'm
use
what
an,
I,
oh, I'm sorry,
I'm
no, go ahead.
wondering. No, I'm also wondering about the power of talking one on one and getting someone's story versus watching a movie or that Instagram account or whatever. Have you looked at those differences of who you have access to actually talk about and how that affects your
Well,
taking in of the story versus like media giving it to you?
well, right. I mean, surely when it's one on one, you have the give and take of it, right? Because then we interact rather than it being kind of presented in a one sided way.
Right.
At the same time, I mean, I really think that so a lot of part of what I teach has to do with formation of children in
Mhm.
ministry settings, right? And I'm working on a project actually currently where I'm looking at how children's literature, particularly young adult literature, so think about fantasy fiction that young adults often get very interested in, and
Mhm.
how their reading of young adult fantasy fiction actually shapes their capacity to envision a world where the gospel makes sense. So, for
Mm.
example, Lois Lowry's books, The Givers, which The Giver is only one in a series, so there's three other books after that. It's a quartet, but the
Okay.
whole series of books looks at how the whole world shifts because one person sees the world differently and their whole world shifts because of that. And even though when you're reading it, there's no give and take. Jonas is the character's name, so the child reading about Jonas, seeing this flash of red, doesn't he can't engage with Jonas in an actual conversation the way you and I.
Mhm.
But I
Mhm.
still think that even that kind of one-sided-ish media portrayal of it, whether it's a book or a movie or even um, an Instagram account, that's that may be less than the actual relationship with someone, but it can still be totally transformative. I think that if you read books and you hear these stories in other ways like that, that still strike your imagination in a way you go,
Mhm.
ha, I never saw the world that way before. I never thought about it like that. That can still work even just from being aware of what's going on Instagram or Facebook.
Right. I love it. You must love those libraries, that program. I know it started in Denmark, but I think it's kind of in the US as well, where you can check a person out of the library for an hour conversation. Have you
Isn't
heard of this?
that is awesome? Isn't that awesome?
I'm just, yeah, the way in which that would allow you to have a conversation with someone you're not normally going to meet.
Right, absolutely. Now, I also think that one another thing to think about, and this gets a little bit tricky for a lot of reasons, but I think that for the story sharing to be
Mhm.
most truly formative for either party does require a degree of vulnerability.
Mhm.
I have to be willing to let down that guard that we've been trained by our culture to build up, to
Right.
open up, to allow others to come in and to actually know the me that I really work hard to hide from people. And so, I think that takes time, like repeated conversations over a period of time, and I think that's an important consideration for the church that we
Yeah.
don't get to know people by one brief encounter, though So I don't want to dismiss the importance of that first brief encounter,
Right.
but we have to repeatedly come back to inviting people in and to receiving them. And, this makes me think Miguel de la Torre is a liberation theologian at ILIF School of Theology in Denver.
Okay.
But
Hmm.
when he speaks about hospitality, I mean, again, he's speaking as a liberation theologian. One of
Hmm.
the things he points out is that speaking in hospitality is that it's never our house,
Mm.
right? So when
Right.
Christians speak of hospitality, I think that's a key thing to recognize. I do think it's important for us to receive well, to welcome actively um, all of the others that come into our lives, into the church, into our worship spaces, into our um, collective public Christian life. But I think it's really important that Miguel de la Torre is correct, that it's not mine or ours in the first place. So, whatever hospitality it is that I have to offer is really just me sharing hospitality that's already been offered to me. It's not mine. It's not like I own it. It's not like any of it belongs to me. It's it's that because I've already received it, I can now kind of spread it,
I
open
love
it
it.
up to others.
Someone just wrote in, Lisa Crammy, thank you, wrote, there's also an app called StoryCorps where you can interview someone and then it gets archived in the Library of Congress.
Right, right, and that's great. Thank you for reminding me of that. There's sometimes they play them on NPR too. I've
Yes,
heard that.
yes.
I've heard that a couple of times. The StoryCorps stories when I've
Hmm.
been getting ready for things in the morning,
Hmm.
and those are fascinating. Absolutely right. And then that lets other people share the benefit of those stories, and they go beyond just again they go beyond just generic facts about someone into the stories of their lives.
Right, and it increases the reach because then anyone with an iPhone can be the interviewer,
Right, absolutely. Right.
not
And
just
then
where NPR can get to.
right, exactly. And then we can all that's thank you for reminding us of that. That's very
Yeah,
important.
thank you, Lisa. Yeah. So I hope we're not all derailing you. We're all loving this, like, how do you collect stories and where are they?
Well, I think it's a fascinating idea, collecting stories. I mean, and this is it's okay. It is a little bit of a side note, but that's fine. I think what an interesting thing it would be. So here's an idea I think would be really neat for churches to do for a great way to involve youth in this. I mean, I think this is
Hmm.
a way you could actually. I mean, and how many? Almost all of our youth have access to smartphones.
Right.
How cool would it be if we had congregations where the youth in the congregations were doing these stories and interviewing elderly people in the congregation?
Yes. And just a note that we have all kinds of wonderful backup people behind the scenes with these webinars. So once this webinar is posted online, they're going to have the link to that app, that StoryCorps app. So if
Oh,
you
that's great.
are listening after the fact, or if you're listening live and just will give us 24 hours, you will see the link to the StoryCorps app if you want to use it and do what Mindy is suggesting, have the youth collect stories.
Because I think that would be an incredibly powerful experience for youth, for anybody in a congregation to do, but particularly for younger people to get the story of the older folks in their
Mm,
lives that they may know the stories of their parents or their grandparents. Maybe they don't, but they may know the stories of their parents and grandparents. But what
right.
about the stories of the person that sits in front of them every Sunday? You know, that they don't, I mean, they know that person, but have they ever had the time for those stories? I think that would be a really interesting project for congregations to look at. That would be a fun thing to do. You know, I can imagine 10, 11, 12-year-olds actually having a really good time with that.
And
You
they're
know,
so cool because they get to use the iPhone.
they would love that. They would love getting to do it. And I mean, you know that they love being the ones that understand all the technology when the adults
Right,
don't. And
right.
which is totally true with me. I mean, I'm always handing my phone or something to a child and saying,
Hmm.
"Please help me.
Right.
I want it to
Fix
do
this.
this. Can you make it?"
Right. And they do.
And they do, like by magic.
Right.
They're incredible. And so yeah, that would be a really neat to use StoryCorps as a way of helping congregations get to know their own story. You know, letting the younger folks lead us in that and helping us get to know one another's stories. That would be a really interesting project to do.
Hmm. And it
So
takes down some of that threatening of like, you're allowed to approach because it's a project for the church, you
right,
know.
absolutely right. And so part of what, I'm sorry, was there?
There's just one more thing from Jennifer.
Okay.
We're looking into developing a library of people telling their faith stories at our church. We hope to start with our church council. My question is, how do you help people develop their story? Do you have a list of key questions to help with this process?
Well, I haven't thought about that because that idea of doing this as a project within the church just came from the previous question or comment. But I think that just getting people started talking, often you get stories. So
Hmm.
maybe asking questions about earliest memories in church would be one way of getting getting somebody to start thinking about their faith story. What brought you into that's going to vary so much, and even denominationally, that's going to be such a
Right.
different way in which that would be framed. Um, the
You
Lutherans
can
don't
do
use.
some of those like HR type questions. Tell me about a time when you X, but you fill it
Yeah,
in. Tell me about a time you felt close to God. Tell me about a time you felt far away from God. Some of that
the first time you can,
stuff.
the first time you remember taking communion. I mean, that would be an interesting
Yeah,
question to find out. Or if you visited other churches. I mean, the first time you've been to a church as a visitor, what was that like? I mean, I'm not really sure that there would be a limit on the ways that you could get someone kind of thinking and talking about their faith stories.
I love
And
it.
it might not
Samantha
even be
says,
church
oh,
related. I'm sorry, go ahead.
that's true. No, I'm sorry. Samantha said a good question is when they remember first really doubting their faith and how they got through that. Thank you, Samantha.
That's a very good question, right? And that would be an important one actually for young people. So as someone who teaches young adults, one of the
Yes.
things that I find out is many of our young adult students, when they first have kind of a crisis of faith, they honestly, in a very naive way, often believe that this has never happened to anybody but them. They
Right.
don't imagine that and they're adults because they're 18 to 22 years old, but they're such young adults. They don't imagine that the older adults, the people that they see as kind of pillars of faith, they just don't imagine that those adults have ever doubted. And so to open up that question would actually be very
Mm,
helpful because it would help younger folks recognize that no, all of the adults in your life that look to you like pillars of faith, that didn't come easy for them. They too went through times of struggle, times of doubt, times of wrestling with God. And I think being more open, I mean that part of our story, being vulnerable as adults to our youth to say that, part of my story has involved struggles and doubts and problems. It's not all been exactly what the veneer that we put on it in church on Sunday morning. So that
mm.
would be, I think that would be a great question to start with for people.
I love it. Nicole said the app Faith Talk has a great conversation starter, and she's used it at restaurants. She used it at a restaurant and ended up learning a lot about her mother-in-law. And also, somebody I'm like scrolling. Michael uses the Peer Ministry Leadership's acronym WHEAT, WHEAT, and I'm sorry I don't know what all those letters stand for, but that's very easily Googleable.
It is.
Peer Ministry Leadership's WHEAT model of what to talk about when you don't know someone well.
Those are great. That's great. Thank you. Thank everybody for the suggestions. Those are wonderful to have those resources
Yeah.
to look
And
at.
then one last one. Thank you. And then I know we have a lot of slides to get through, and we're all loving the first slide. Karen said, I think there are a lot of lists of questions on the Vibrant Faith website. Also, a few interview questions are included in confirmation curriculums like Faith Inc. and Here We
Oh,
Stand.
right. Very good.
So thank you all for jumping in. I don't want to cut off anyone. I just want to make sure we honor also the material that was prepared. Oh, somebody wrote where, hobby, events, aquany, and travel. I'm not sure what the A is. Maybe it's a typo. Acquaintance, sorry. So that wheat thing was where do you live, a hobby, events, acquaintances, and travel.
Oh,
So
that's
I'll
the
turn,
acronym. That
yeah.
was what the acronym meant. Okay, good. Thank you.
Yes, and then Samantha said we've tried to let our high school youth know that they are welcome to question and share their doubts in the group, judgment free. In fact, we love it because it means they're thinking about their faith. Thank you, Samantha, and thank you everyone with all these great feedback about how to get people talking about their stories.
And that actually that helps make a very good segue to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is how hearing these different stories will really help me to see the world differently. And so answering those questions and realizing, getting other people's answers to all of these questions will help me to see that my experience isn't the only one. So I'm going to use just a quick example that everybody pretty much knows this story, so I won't read the whole story to you, but the story of the Good Samaritan. So quick summary, right? You have the lawyer stands up to test Jesus. What do I have to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says to him, you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Right? So that's
Mhm.
really important. The lawyer is asking, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? And the answer, love your neighbor as yourself. So then the lawyer says to Jesus, so who is my neighbor? And there we get this story that Jesus tells him about the man going down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. And you know the story. He gets injured. He is attacked by a group of robbers who beat him up, leave him on the side of the street. He's half dead. Right. So a priest goes by, doesn't passes on the other side. A Levite goes by, passes on the other side. And we often get into arguments and conversations about why they passed by, but let that sit for a second. They pass by. A Samaritan who comes, who is moved by pity, takes care of him, takes him to an inn, and tells the innkeeper, you take care of him, I'll pay you for it. And then he asks, the Jesus then asks the lawyer, so who is the one who is who is the one who is the neighbor to the man? Who was the neighbor? Remember, the
Mhm.
question started with, who is my neighbor? And Jesus doesn't answer that question. Instead, he then asks, so who's the one who was a neighbor? And the lawyer says, the one who showed mercy. So the Samaritan, Jesus responds, go and do likewise. So we know that often the way this gets interpreted, when we hear this in sermons, American kind of culture,
Mhm.
we hear this very much from the perspective of the Samaritan. And we all hear this as a sense of a moral kind of, that's what we should do. We all know we should go and be the Good Samaritan. There's kind of a moral command there to go and be
Mhm.
the Good Samaritan. Jesus wants us to be kind to those who are injured or poor or in need.
Right.
And I think that's all right and good. But it does assume there's a presumption of a certain level of privilege and power in our reading of that story. It presumes that when I hear that story, I'm going to be the person who's capable of doing good and helping the person in the ditch. I think very, very rarely do we collectively, particularly perhaps in American churches, ever think that maybe we're the fellow on the side of the road. we don't
Right.
we don't want that story. We want the story of being the Good Samaritan. I want my story of myself to be that story where I have the power and the privilege that lets me be the Good Samaritan, the one that can be just happening down the road and do this good deed. I'll feel better about myself. I'll know I have done exactly what Jesus said. I have gone and shown mercy. But one thing that I think is an interesting and important thing when we open our lives up to the story of others is a recognition that sometimes that's not my story. Right? Sometimes
Mhm.
my story might be to be the fellow on the side of the road. And sometimes my story might put me in the role of the innkeeper, right?
Or what are we sometimes the robber? That
And
crossed my mind.
exactly. And then sometimes we're even the robber, right?
And we don't want to
Sometimes
admit that about ourselves.
absolutely not. And that line runs through each and every one of us. Those stories are part of who we are. And so part of what I think is interesting is to think about the next day. How do we tell this story? If this is our story, imagine yourself the next day at work or wherever, a pizza place, talking to whoever. And the next day you're telling them, this is what happened to me yesterday. Well, we know how we're going to tell the story if we're the Good Samaritan, right? I was
Mhm.
driving down the road, and for us to put it in a more, current context, I'm driving down the road. There's this accident on the side of the road. This guy looks like he fell off of his bike, so I stopped and I helped and I called the ambulance. And boy, that was sort of scary, but I'm really glad that I was there, right? I mean, we're good at telling that story. But how might thinking about how we would tell the story the next day if we were the Samaritan? I mean, not the Samaritan, but the guy on the side of the road, or like you just said, the
Mhm.
robber themselves. How does that shape how we then are able to imagine the world in a different way? If it takes our position of power and privilege off the table, does that question make sense?
Right.
Because we're used to being in positions of power and privilege. American Christians, we're that's a presumption that we have, that we're the ones that are that Jesus is speaking to go and do the good deed. But what if the good deed needs to be done for us? Or what if we're the ones that have sinned? Or what if we're just the innkeeper who's just this kind of person on the side who obviously plays an important role in this, but he gets like two notes and that's it. I mean, he's almost ignored in the story.
Wow. Yeah, so that change, I mean, shifting who you perceive yourself to be in the world is pretty dramatic.
Right. I think absolutely. I mean, I think it's a huge difference in this presumption that we have power that we don't actually have. Um, and so anyway, just a way of thinking about the story differently, and wondering, kind of really wondering aloud, if I learn to think about the story from those different perspectives, how does that help me to welcome people with those totally
I
different
apologize for her. She
stories
goes, oh, it's all right. She goes,
into my
oh, wait, are
life?
you an Okie?
I think that Chris's mute just came off mute, so
Oh,
I let
okay.
him know. Sorry about that noise in there.
That's
So go ahead with your last question. I got distracted.
Oh, okay. So I'm sorry. So what I was asking was, how would it change the way, or would how, to what extent would kind of an imaginative ability to read scripture in such a way that I'm not presuming I'm the Samaritan, I'm not presuming I'm always that person that has that power and privilege, how would me being able to imagine myself, we collectively being able to imagine ourselves in these other roles, how might that impact our ability to then engage the other that comes to us in a different and more empathetic way?
Right, especially as the innkeeper, because the innkeeper was just doing as told.
Exactly. It's just doing his job.
Like, not particularly a hero,
No, just
just doing
there.
his thing.
Right. And I mean, how often is that our story?
Right,
I'm not necessarily particularly heroic, but I'm just there.
right.
Or
You said
how
that.
often are
Yeah.
we sometimes the robbers?
Right. And sometimes that is more passively than actively, but it's
Right.
still true.
Right. I mean, how? I mean, as one kind of concrete example, as I'm sitting at my desk right now, I can look around and see without moving. I have my laptop, I have a tablet, and I have a cell phone, all of which
Hmm.
are computer technologies, just from where I'm sitting.
Hmm.
There's not a one of those that I can safely assume was made without the use of child slave labor.
Right. We just don't know.
So I'm not a robber in my
Hmm.
definition, but at the same time, and I've certainly never hurt someone or made some child work in a sweatshop so that I would have technology, and yet I'm complicit in that always. And so
Hmm.
how does learning to tell the story as the robber help me to recognize that part of my own life, my own story?
Well, it's very challenging in an interconnected world. Sometimes that feels so huge that people kind of shut down.
Right, absolutely. It's terrifying. I mean,
Hmm.
it really is a very difficult thing. And
Hmm.
so learning these different ways of hearing the different people's stories, it seems to me helps us to open up. It's not just one. I'm not just one part of this. I don't have just one story. I'm a mix of all of these stories.
And even sort of the victim here doesn't stay a victim.
No,
They
absolutely
they
not.
accepted the help someone else, and that other person brought them to a larger system of help, and we can assume they got better because we all meet people who are kind of lifelong victims,
Right, right,
and that's not a very pleasant storyline either.
right.
But this victim moved out of it by accepting the help of the neighbor, the unexpected neighbor.
Absolutely. And so if you were to tell this story later, I mean, one thing that I think is an interesting thing to do is to now imagine it. Imagine for a minute that you're, maybe we don't want to be the robber, but imagine we are the innkeeper. All
Okay,
right. So
yes.
let's
Yeah.
imagine for a minute. Let's just everybody collectively, let's imagine you're the innkeeper. How are you going to tell this story to your spouse tomorrow or to your best friend?
Hmm. Hmm.
What sort of story are you going to tell? What are the details that are going to matter tomorrow?
Wow, that's huge. Jonathan wrote, he leads an informal style worship every Wednesday for his congregation and always starts the sermon portion by asking people where they find themselves in the story that day. We have good conversations, and sometimes he is surprised by where people find themselves. Thank you, Jonathan.
Right, very interesting. Good, thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
And part of what a willingness, so part of what that's a great, I think it's a great idea asking people where they find themselves. And then part of what that requires is the person receiving the information to be ready to listen to it. Right? When we invite
Hmm.
people to tell these stories, there has to be a reciprocation where we're like we're open to hearing them, knowing that sometimes the stories may not be ones we want to hear. I might not want to hear the story of the robber.
Right.
I might not want to know what made him the way he was, what made that make sense to him at the time. That might be a story that I find scary, off putting in some way. I might reject that story. And so if we're inviting people in and we're asking them to share their stories, part of what we then need to be willing to do is to actually engage those stories and hear them, to listen to them in an active and engaged way.
It's also, I see that as some of the breakdowns in sort of online arguments, is
Right.
that people put their worldview onto someone else's situation, and then the judgment comes from, I wouldn't do that if I were in that situation, but they haven't taken the time to understand that person's story and why it made the most sense for them.
Right, exactly. And so I think that's an important that's where there's concrete skills that I think we can actually learn. I mean that listening, whereas conversation seems like it should come naturally, this give and take that we have between one another,
Right,
in the same way that there's a kind of a collective cultural issue with not sharing our stories particularly well. We often keep them tight to ourselves. We don't necessarily open up very well. There's also a sense in which we don't necessarily always know how to receive somebody else's story particularly well.
right. It's threatening.
It can be very threatening, and it can make us want to fix things, right? I mean, there's this sense of well, but I can, if you'll just listen to what I have to say, then you won't have that problem anymore because I can tell you how to do it better, right? I can
Right.
tell you how to do it right. I can tell you how to avoid being in this situation again. And so I think this call to receive stories needs to come with it. This practice of engaged listening so that you're receiving the story well.
I love that. And that's a good segue. Karen just wrote a little bit ago, thank you for being patient. Each synod in the ELCA can send two youth to the Youth Leadership Summit that's coming up. And Lyle Greiner will be leading peer ministry training. That's where that WHEAT acronym comes from. And peer ministry is all about learning to listen well. So your synod will have more information about that. And I assume things come up all the time. So even if you're listening to the recording, still contact your synod and ask about peer ministry. But that's helping kids learn to listen well. That's what
That's
it
great.
is.
That's wonderful. Right. And so, I mean, there's some simple things that we can do to help people learn to listen. I mean, one of them is actually just listening, right? I mean, like part
Right.
of it is like hearing another person's story and letting it unfold sort of naturally, maintaining silence, not dead silence, but
Right.
the appropriate kind of space to provide that space for someone to tell their story. And kind of being fully present to them, where you're maintaining eye contact, where you have body language that's reflecting that you're interested in what the other person is saying. When if they're struggling with telling the story, you can encourage them along the way. If they're having trouble, sometimes telling a story is a problem because there's a language barrier. I'm trying to
Mm.
learn. I'm trying to learn Italian right now because I want to.
Ooh, nice.
Oh, yeah, just for fun. And so I have a colleague who's Italian, and he's helping me with it. There are many times I know exactly what I want to say when we're practicing talking, but I don't know the word. And so
Right.
I'm reaching and searching for words, and it takes incredible patience on his part to be someone who will just sit and let me struggle with that lack of vocabulary, um, kind of the right amount of time. right? You don't want to let somebody struggle till they give up in frustration, but at the same time, you don't want to jump in and give them words. You don't want to be putting words in people's mouths. And so all of these kind of engage these listening skills that we can learn to help one another help receive the story of other people.
Right. And there's that whole list on the screen there of things you can be
Yes.
doing when you are an engaged listener.
Right. Thank you. Yes. So, I mean, this is just, and this is just a simple list of ideas, but, and there's other things that I'm sure you can find in other places, but these just a starting point of thinking about, I mean, one of the things is if you're listening to somebody else's story, you don't want to contradict it, right? I mean, you want to be listening to it, hearing what they have to say, encouraging them. I think asking questions that clarify is important, and yet not asking questions that try to contradict, right? That no, that's not the way it really happened. You can't possibly feel that way. You want to, I think, to try to help. So what I this always sounds funny to me, but from a counseling class, what I hear you saying is,
Right,
you
right.
know, and I think everybody
Yeah.
that's ever done any kind of counseling classes, you kind of that almost comes across as sounding funny, but there's something right about that. So, am I hearing this? This is how you experienced that. This is how that made you feel. Um, I'm
Or there's Brene Brown has a thing about when you do this, the story I make up is, it's those 5 words, the story I make up.
uh-huh.
So, like, I know you're just doing this, but to me, it means these 20 other things, and that's why I'm reacting this way.
Right, right. Brene
So,
Brown's material is very good. Right,
yes, of just acknowledging that as much as you want to just hear the story, you are layering your own meaning onto it, and you need to just name it so that it clears the air.
right. That's very helpful.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then there are specific things that we want to avoid doing when you're hearing, receiving someone else's story. I mean, part of it is I think if we take seriously that hearing somebody else's story is the reception of a gift, and if you recognize that when someone opens up to you and shares their story with you, that this really is the giving and receiving of a gift. It's not just an everyday conversation. This isn't how is the weather or, would you please pass the sugar. There's
Right.
something a lot more important at stake. And that recognition that it's a gift that has to be received and needs to be received well, then these kind of engaged listening skills or activities may be more helpful. And then there's a kind of corollary to that of things that we want to avoid doing, right? I mean, if you're going to be listening, then the silence that's there, the space that you're giving, also necessarily means that there are certain things you're not doing, right? So the next slide shows kind of a list of habits to avoid, right? You want to not kind of cut into the other person's story
Hmm.
or assume you know it. And just because I got a similar story, then that doesn't necessarily mean I know your story, because all the stories, so even if we experience a very similar event, all of the stories that make up the you that experienced that event and all the stories that make up the me that experienced that event make us different people, so that our experience of it could be very different even if we experience the same event. And this is seen routinely in traumatic
Hmm.
events, that different people who experience similar traumas respond drastically differently,
Hmm.
and the aftermath of that story will be very different based on the individual's perception of what happened. And so when we're receiving the story of someone else, to recognize that even if we've experienced something similar, that doesn't mean we understand how that person experienced it.
And it's that age-old thing also learned in counseling classes. You don't say, I know exactly how you feel, because
Right.
you don't.
Because you
But if
don't.
it seems empathetic, but it's not
Right.
helpful.
No,
Yes,
exactly.
right. Thank you. I'm loving the rest of this list. Do we want to work through it?
Sure. All right. Right, we just said understanding the way the other person feels or making moral judgments on it. I mean, you kind of
Mm.
alluded to this before. I think that sense of, well, I wouldn't have made that decision, right? Surely I would have been kinder or more gentle or more peaceful or whatever. I wouldn't have jumped from here to there. And I think trying to avoid that, assuming that we would have somehow or another not only responded differently, but inherently better than the other person. It's not a helpful one. And even if you don't say those things, when those are your internal, when that's what's going on in your head, that shows in your body language. Right? So even
Right.
if I never say, "Boy, I can't believe you were that stupid," or "I can't believe you did that," or "I can't believe, I would have never done that," even if those
Mm.
words are never uttered, if that's my gut response to somebody else's story, it's very likely to show in body language and facial expression and in the ways that I respond to them.
Right. They pick it up. They see
They
it.
pick it
They
up.
feel
They absolutely pick it up. I mean, one of the really critical things in thinking about is how we describe things, how I describe what another person's doing, even if this description is totally internal to me. I'm not saying it out loud, but
it. Right.
how I explain to myself, how I describe to myself the other person's story, that will affect how I act. And so I will respond to that story based on the internal dialogue that I'm having about that story. So if my internal dialogue that is never expressed, it's just my internal dialogue, is one of judgment, then I will act in accordance with that judgment, even if I never, ever, ever utter those words. And so that connects to that next slide of that not being impatient, or the not next slide, but the next point,
Hmm.
not becoming impatient or angry or anxious if the story is not what you expect it to be, because that's going to show. Because there's no way for me to be openly receptive to another story. This isn't like a choose your own adventure, right?
Right. Where I
I
get to
don't,
pick.
right? I don't get to pick how your story is told. So this
Right.
isn't, the choose your own adventure type of story. My job as the listener, the receiver of the gift of another person's story, is to receive it as it is, not as I want it to be. I mean, it may in fact not at all be the story that I want, but my
Right.
reception of it means receiving it as it actually is. And that connects directly with not making it about me. I mean, it's not my story. I think often our assumption isn't so much. I mean, I do think we do often make things about ourselves, but I think sometimes our inclination isn't that. Is that we don't want the story to be as somebody else's story to be as painful as it is, or as sad as it is, or so we're trying to find some way of casting it in a better light rather than receiving it simply as a gift as it is,
And dwelling in it with them.
and being present in that moment with that person as they're sharing that story.
Hmm. That's difficult. It's vulnerable.
It is very vulnerable, and it can lead to some very uncomfortable moments. But I think that that's where grace happens. I mean, in those moments, I think that that's where the Holy Spirit meets us in this conversation with the other person, in this moment of sharing where words really do fail. But that's where the Holy Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words,
Mm-hmm. Hmm. And just dwelling in it.
and just dwelling in it.
I love also just this very practical planning your response while the speaker is still talking.
Right. I think
People pick that up as well.
most of us do that, right? You think, well,
Right.
and sometimes because if you're letting somebody else talk for a fairly long period of time and they say something, and you're like, I really want to validate that, but you're waiting until they get to a good place so you can validate that. So you're thinking in your head, well, I wanted to validate that, so I got to remember it so I
Right.
don't forget it by the time they. And so I mean, it can even come from a good place. I mean, I think that to give
Yeah.
us all the to credit our intentions, I think it can come from a good place, but it still keeps me from really receiving the other person.
It's also, I don't think we spend a ton of time, or maybe this is just me and my story. I don't often spend time with people saying, now it's your turn for your story, and we're going
Right.
to stick with your story. And my related story will for sure not happen.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Like it's
Right.
usually just a lot more back and forth.
Right.
They're most of the way through their story, and I'm like, as a way of connecting, oh, something similar happened to me. Now here's my
Mhm.
story, and it's not as sort of creating this holy space where it's not going to bounce back and forth, but it's really one person's place, unless I'm doing something formal like coaching,
Right.
counseling, where, it's a sort of designated relationship.
Right, exactly. And the real give and take is actually what I think we want in the church. I mean, I think we want the give and take of stories, the sharing and receiving. And so I don't mean these kind of habits that we want to avoid, or the
Mhm.
engaged listening sort of things that we want to do to be a script that we follow, but just to be principles to think about.
Yes. So Paul is building upon this Brene Brown shout out from earlier, recommending the book Daring Greatly. And I have
Right.
read that as well about vulnerability. So Paul recommends that. And then Karen recommends the book Nonviolent Communication, which I am not familiar with. So thank you, Karen. I'll have to look that one up.
Yes,
And these
thank
are
you.
all links that are fabulous behind the scenes. People can find links to Amazon or wherever these books are sold, so you can find that on the replay page as well.
Thank you. Those are
Do you
great.
have any other books you want, like where have you dwelt as you have researched all of this stuff?
Well,
Do you
one of the books actually that I will shout out to, which may not be one that people would necessarily assume, because it's actually not a book about stories or about listening, and particularly it's a New Testament book. But Mark Allen Powell is a New Testament professor, has a great book called What Do They Hear?
ooh, good.
And the subtitle I cannot remember, but it's something like From Pulpit to Pew or something like that. But it's
Okay.
one of his books that's on preaching. It's actually a preaching text,
Okay.
and I'm not ordained. I don't preach, but I think it's one of the best books on communication that I've read. It's a wonderful book on thinking about how the things that we say, the way we tell stories, um, and the way people receive them may not always be what we think.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a really really good book. I mean, it's a great chapter on social location, on how the difference of kind of what I was getting at the beginning, the story that I bring to our conversation, how that's going to shape how I what I come away from it with.
Someone wrote it's the real title if you're trying to Google it, Bridging the Gap Between Pulpit and Pew.
Thank you, bridging the
Yeah.
gap. I knew there was something about between pulpit and pew and couldn't remember
Right.
what it was. So
Yeah,
yes,
you were
what
on
did
it. You
hear?
were on it enough that someone else was able to give us the
Right.
right
Thank you
title.
very much. I didn't try Googling real quickly while I was talking.
No, don't. We have other
I
people.
totally lose my train of thought if I did that. But I really would recommend that book. And it's, even though it is marketed as, looks like it is a preaching textbook, and it is that. So for any pastors out there, it's really good for that. But it's also a really good book for anybody who talks to other people. I mean, it doesn't have to be about, if you
So like
ever talk to
everyone.
other people, then it's a really good book about that kind of thinking about how, and he uses I mean, he's a New Testament professor, so he uses very scriptural examples and preaching examples, but the application is good, whether you're preaching or not.
Wow. Well, we're near the end of our hour. It went quickly for me, but I want to let you have one last statement and then I have a couple announcements. So do you have just a closing thought?
Well, sure. Thank you very much. First of all, just to thank you for this opportunity, and to kind of reiterate that we're all a question. We're all a matter of stories. All of us are our stories. So that, in fact, the church is a story. The whole church is a story. The church is storied into being. It isn't just
Mhm.
this thing that's out there. The church only exists because of the story that's been told about the church, and that's an important part of all of our stories. And the story of the church is made up of all of the little stories that we add to it. And our willingness to receive and welcome in other people into that story, and then they bring their stories to it, enriches all of our lives, because it's enriching all of our common story as well.
And we learn from one another
And
and move forward.
we are shaped, we learn, but we're also formed by. I mean, we become different, and hopefully better ways because of that. Exactly.
Wonderful. And Samantha, just, I don't want to lose your comment. I know it's right here at the tail end. She just wrote a hard subject is how to express to someone else, especially someone you love, that they are not listening well. Thank you, Samantha. That might be a whole separate
Right.
subject, but I just wanted to get that in there because it's very real for a lot of people.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you. And thank you, Mindy, for being here. I just have a couple of announcements. So this webinar, along with all of the others in the series, is being recorded and can be found on the Practice Discipleship website. You'll see it there on your page. It's practicediscipleship.org. So please feel free, download it, use it. Volunteers, church council, adult forums, colleagues. This is for anyone you have contact with that might benefit from the content you heard here today. You can also download from the Practice Discipleship site videos and curriculum from previous years. There has been a lot of good stuff in the past, so please, please go back and look at that. So each synod in the ELCA has a practice discipleship coach who's been trained to offer seminars on these webinars locally in your own synod. So if you would like to dig into some of this material live and in person in a room, that's happening in your synod. So training events are posted on this same website, so keep checking back for updates. You can also find event dates on the Network app for iPhone and Android. The free app gives you anytime access to videos, network news, and calendar of events, an interactive prayer wall, and much more. It really is good. It's very slick and it works well, so definitely take a look at the Network app. Each synod in the ELCA has a practice discipleship coach. Oh, I'm going backwards, my goodness. Sorry, my eye skipped. So moving forward, follow us on Facebook and Twitter. The Facebook page actually already has links to some of the things we talked about today, and the others are coming soon. They're also tweeted, so some of those books and resources that we referred to today you can find there, and you can find us on Twitter at ELCA. PD. If you're searching on the Facebook page, it's the Practice Discipleship Initiative. Our next webinar is scheduled for Tuesday, October 5th. It's an hour earlier, so it'll be at noon Central. So please, right now, mark your calendar because of just that little time shift. We don't want you to miss it. The title is Story of Service, and we'll be talking to Mark Jackson. So thank you for joining us, and we will see you all in October. Have a great day. Goodbye.